Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Emotional Intelligence Pawdcast. I'm your host, Sandra Thompson, founder of EI Evolution, and I am super excited to take you on this incredible journey. We're going to be exploring the transformative world of emotional intelligence and empathy, guided by some truly remarkable humans and their fantastic four-legged friends. In each episode, we'll dive into inspiring and heartwarming stories about our beloved canine companions. We'll discover the unique and magical bonds we share with our dogs and uncover the profound lessons they teach us about understanding and managing our emotions. From tales of loyalty and love to moments of learning and growth, our furry friends have so much to offer when it comes to enhancing our emotional intelligence. We'll also discuss practical tips and insights on how to cultivate empathy and emotional awareness in our daily lives, inspired by the natural wisdom of our dogs. So sit back and relax, maybe even with your playful pup by your side, and join us for an enriching experience that celebrates the incredible ways dogs help us connect more deeply with ourselves and others. Welcome to the Emotional Intelligence Pawdcast. This is one of these fly by the seat of your pants, carpe diem, seize the day kind of moments. I met a lady, an incredible woman called Jo Bloor, at TED in April, and I mentioned to her that I was doing this podcast, and she immediately came back with a couple of people who she thought would be immense. One of those people is a gentleman called Sebastian, who I will introduce you to in just a second. But the intriguing thing here is Sebastian responded to an email yesterday. I invited him to record tomorrow, thinking he might say, no, let's leave it a couple of weeks. And he said yes. So I've got no idea where this conversation is going to go, but I'm already thrilled. Sebastian, how are you and where are you in the world?
Greetings. I'm fine. And I tend to go with let's do this now rather than delay it for a couple of weeks, because who knows what's going to come up in a couple of weeks. And so this morning works. And yeah, I'm talking to you from my little log home across the Yukon River from Dawson City in the Yukon, which is the far northwest corner, the top left-hand corner, if you will, of Canada.
So when I did a little bit of research as to where you were, I learned a whole load. So I did geography A level, but we certainly didn't do in-depth on Canada. So you're here. British Columbia is south. North Territories is just to your right, and you're 4,000 miles away from where I am right now. So it's incredible to be speaking with you. And what an incredibly beautiful place to live.
It is. It's a very special place to live. I grew up in the UK. I left the UK when I was 16 to move to Canada when my family moved here, and I was, you know, like many teenagers at that time, you kind of reluctant to leave your friends and all that stuff. But then I was also excited to come to Canada because I thought, yay, snow. And because, England doesn't do snow very well.
No.
And many parts of Canada actually kind of disappointing when it comes to the winter. But when I came to the Yukon, it was everything I ever dreamed of. So we have really reliable snow all winter, so for months and months and months, if you enjoy snow, and this is relevant to the dog thing that we've got going here. Um, it's a beautiful place. And there's only 40,000 people in the Yukon, and the Yukon is about the size of Germany. So it's pretty intact. Like there are towns and roads, but not very many. Like Dawson City is the second biggest town in the Yukon, and we're just over 2,000 people. Um, so it's
I
not
couldn't
very popular.
do you know, I couldn't believe it when I was doing my little bit of research and I saw that you had a population of about 40,000. I was thinking, what is that, like just in
in Whitehorse. Honestly, I couldn't get my head around it. And the fact that you're twice the size of the UK and you're just part of Canada, it just blows my mind. And some of the pictures that I looked at, the deep snow and the lakes and the trees, I mean, incredible. Can you tell us a little bit about the work that you do? So, what's your responsibility? What are you doing out there?
I have a couple of positions, both of which are revolve around the conservation of fish, wildlife, and their habitat. My day job, if you will, is working for an environmental not-for-profit organization called the Yukon Conservation Society. But I also sit on a couple of, I think in the UK you call them quangos,
Yeah, probably. Yeah.
but here we don't. We call these co-management bodies that come out of the treaties, the modern day treaties that were signed between Canada and most Yukon First Nations. And they set up mechanisms by which most aspects of life in the Yukon are co-managed between the First Nations and the territorial government. And so I sit on the Fish and Wildlife Management Board and the Salmon Subcommittee of the Fish and Wildlife Management Board. So between those three positions, I'm kept busy full time.
Yeah, I can imagine. Well, actually, I can't even imagine how busy you are, because I mean, given the responsibility, because I could see from the strategy actually of the Conservation Society, waters, the preservation, the conservation, all of the stuff that you're doing to ensure that mining is kept well balanced and managed carefully, and your green energy and the waters are kept. So it's I'm kind of thinking about when can I get out there actually. So that's now on my list, Sebastian. Tell us a little bit now, if you don't mind, about your dogs, because there's more than one and there's more than two, it would seem. Tell us a little bit about how many you've got, why have you got so many, and what are they?
Well, they happen to be howling right now. I'm not quite sure whether you can hear them in the background. Now they've stopped, of course. But yeah, so these are the dogs that I have are what we call huskies, and they're not a particular breed. They're definitely a mixture of breeds. They it's a I guess we can call it a breed, but it's not a registered breed. But it's a line of dogs that have all kinds of different breeds mixed in with them, but they've been selected for certain traits that make them ideally suited to pull sleds in the wintertime in the subarctic. So they have double coats, so they stay warm in the wintertime, so they never get cold. They have extremely tough feet, so that they can pound the trail for literally hundreds of miles a day. These dogs are absolutely phenomenal athletes. For these dogs to run a marathon is just like getting started. It's 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 bonkers how far they run. We have 1,000-mile races for these dogs, which they do in about a week. And the dogs can actually travel indefinitely. When they're fully trained and properly looked after, and it's on a decent trail, they can travel 150 miles a day indefinitely, forever, and they're happy to do it. They love doing it. They love doing it just like sheepdogs like herding sheep. Like that's what they like to do. When you first take one of these puppies and put them in harness, it's like they already know what to do. It's astonishing, that you would expect them to get all tangled up in the lines and the harness, but they barely do. They just kind of like put their head down and say, "Yahoo! This is what I do." It's just like sheepdogs when they first get a chance to herd something. They just do it. It's amazing.
So is that why you've got six? Because you need six to pull a sleigh? Is that
That's right. Yeah, you do need uh, a certain number for sure, and and six is actually a very modest number to pull a sled, and so that limits the distance and the speed at which you can travel. So the reason I have these dogs is because for much of my life I've been a commercial salmon fisherman on the Yukon River, and that's before I became a professional environmentalist. And so as a result, I was living in a very remote area, about 50, 60 miles north of here along the Yukon River, far from any roads or anything like that. And so in the wintertime, when we weren't fishing, uh, transportation essentially at that time had to be by dogs. And there's a breed of salmon that came up in the river in the fall that were very abundant and were well suited for feeding, had traditionally been used for feeding sled dogs for millennia. And they'd come at the time of year when you could just basically hang them up and they'd freeze and keep all winter. And so I was able to keep dogs and and fish without it costing me very much, but it also produced transportation for me. And so at at times, when my partner and I were living well off in the bush and we'd do a little bit of like tourism type stuff, we'd have as many as 18 or 19 dogs. So so now that I live basically in this what you might call a suburb, it's not really a suburb. Um, I've let the number of dogs that I have fall just through attrition,
yeah?
and now I have just six.
Wow. So, and I made an error and I was talking about sleighs, and that's obviously Father Christmas. We're talking about sledding, obviously. So, I've seen little clips of these huskies getting ready in anticipation. It's like they've been wound up like little toys. They're like this spring is ready to go, and then they're ready to go. So, now I understand as well the reason why you brought up the snow and the fact that there are conditions that are ideal for the dogs to transport you, but you couldn't get a car or a truck or whatever in some of these areas. That's where you need the agility and the flexibility of having these dogs to transport you around. That's what it sounds
Mhm.
like, right?
Yeah, in recent years, snowmobile technology has improved immensely,
Mm-hmm.
and so when I first got dogs, it made more sense to have dogs than the kind of primitive snow machines that were around at the time.
Yeah,
Now that's no longer the case. People who need transportation in the wintertime mostly use snow machines now. So people who use dogs now do it because they're stubborn. They just love having dogs. And
yeah,
so it used to be that people had dog teams because they needed to have them.
yeah.
And now that's no longer the case.
So, what about their characters? So, you've got six of them. They're the same DNA. Well, I mean, you said that they are quite a mixed. They're a mixture of all sorts of things, but fundamentally, they have the same purpose. They have the same drive. But what about them as individuals? Are they all their own little characters? I'm imagining they are. Well, what have you got?
Well, of course, they're their own little characters. Um, one of the nice things about this particular conversation is I'm talking to dog people who, so you don't have to explain what goes on inside of a dog. But, doggy DNA. the genome of a dog is much bigger than that of a human. So that means that there can be a lot more variety amongst dogs. And we all know that we can have everything from Great Danes to Chihuahuas to Huskies, right? And they're all originally wolves, but now
Mm.
they're different, right?
Yeah.
And so even among dogs that are a particular registered breed, they're very finely bred. Even then, you wind up with very different personalities, right?
Mm.
So just because you've got a golden retriever, you can have them with different levels of smarts and different types of personalities, lazy and keen and stuff like that. And the same thing applies to these dogs. So yeah, my dogs have very different personalities. They have different levels of eagerness to please. Some of them just like would die for you, and others just want to do their own thing.
so so certainly I've been reading some books by vets in the UK, and they talk about these very different personalities depending on the experiences the dog has had, the meaning they've attached to things, the interactions they've had with other people obviously will create different personalities and different temperaments. So do they get on as a group? I mean, we assume that the dogs live in a pack and they have a kind of pecking order. Is that the case with your six?
Well, um, they do live as a pack, if you like, or a group, a
Group, yeah.
team. We like to
A
call
team,
it. So
yeah.
I think that implies more cohesiveness.
Mm.
And do they have a pecking order? I would prefer that they don't. That
Okay.
there's only one boss, and that's me. Um, so so no, they don't really have a pecking order.
Mm.
Do they get along? Yes, like they get to. Dogs are tethered most of the time, primarily for their own safety, but
Mm.
they're tethered within an area about 4 acres, where that I can let them loose for a couple of hours every day, where they can just race around and chew bones and dig holes and pee on things, do stuff like what dogs like to do.
Yeah.
And they absolutely play with each other. They get along with they more or less get along quite well with each other. I like
Mm.
to think of these dogs like 10-year-old boys, like most of the time they get along, but every once in a while, things happen and they don't get along so good. And then you got to step in and sort of say, hey, smarten up. So that can happen. So I would never leave all six of them running around loose together in that field, without supervision. Like I need to be close enough that I can see and hear if something goes wrong. But no, they get along. They get along well.
No, that's brilliant. I mean, I've got two sisters, and that's not six of us. That's enough to contend with, right? um, and are they all roughly the same age, or have you got some that have come up as puppies, as others perhaps have moved on or perhaps passed away? What's their, are they the same age ish?
It no, not quite. So three of them are from the same litter, and they're about 6 years old,
Right.
and two of them are from the same litter, and they're probably 10 years old. And I've got another one that I adopted, and I really don't know for sure how old she is,
Okay.
but
Right.
she's probably, I honestly don't know. She's at least 8 or 9, but she could be as much as 13 or 14. One of
Wow.
the things that's really unusual about, remarkable about huskies, in my experience, is their longevity and how long they stay fit and healthy. So with many breeds, like they're starting to look kind of old by the time they're 9 or 10, but it's quite common for huskies to live well into their teens. Most of my dogs live until they're uh, 17, and the odd one will live to 18 or 19. Not very many of them die. Occasionally, dogs do die younger for various reasons, like they
Yeah.
get sick or something like that.
Mm.
But they live a remarkably long time, and they're still
Yeah.
able to to work as sled dogs into their teams as well. So most of my dogs don't will retire themselves, like they'll
Yeah.
just go like, this doesn't work for me anymore. And it's usually around the age of 14 or even 15 when they retire themselves. So there's a lot
Right.
of breeds of dogs that very rarely make it to that age. And
That's true.
so
Yeah.
it's remarkable that these guys are still out there doing their thing.
Mm.
It's like 75 or 80-year-old marathoners, like
I
they
know.
exist. But we got a whole breed of them that do this.
It was going to be one of my questions actually, because I did wonder how long they could sustain that. And you've answered my question. So thank you. Thank you very much for that. So let's move on now to empathy and compassion or emotional intelligence. And I'm curious
Mhm.
to know what we as humans could learn from your dogs as far as their behavior, their empathy, or the things that they do that make us think, oh, wow.
That is a very difficult question. And when I realized that we were going to talk about empathy with dogs and relationships to them, I I thought about how I thought I would talk about how the bond between humans and sled dogs can be very, very intense,
Mm,
particularly if you are off doing trips or long distance races and stuff like that, where you develop a level of utter dependency upon each other. So you can
okay.
imagine that when you're miles and miles off in the wilderness, if your
Yeah.
dogs just decide that they're not going to do any more work, they're just going to go on strike, they
Yeah.
kind of hoop. And so there has to that so they develop, and at the same time, if you run out of dog food, they're kind of hooped, right?
Yeah.
So there's this mutual trust and dependency that builds up. And if you're spending 24 hours a day on the trail and camping out with them and stuff like that, that
Mm,
level, that relationship builds to a very, very intense level. It's like nothing I'd ever experienced with any other animal before.
wow.
Um, so you asked what we can learn from dogs. I think that depends upon the human. Some of us are quick learners and some of us are not.
Yeah.
Um, uh, I think a lot of what we can learn is around trusting. So you think about how a sled dog team works. And you've basically got, all of these dogs tied to a rope in front of your sled.
Yeah.
And you need to trust them to all go in the same direction.
Yeah.
And you don't have any reins like you do for a horse or even a reindeer.
Mm,
So it's all voice commands and, like kind of hoping for the best. So if the dogs actually do decide to do the wrong thing, like they see a squirrel, um, there's not a lot you can do about it. Seven dogs has about as much force as strength as a horse.
yeah.
So, and sometimes we have dog teams that are 12, 14, even more dogs in a team.
Yeah.
And so it's very powerful. And so you have to have this level of trust and bond and empathy between you so that you can work together. So, for
Mm,
example, if my sled falls over and I'm laying on the ground, I want the dogs to stop because
sure.
they care that I'm
Yeah.
bouncing along behind the sled, you know, um, or being left behind,
Yeah.
right? Because you can't run after them and catch them; they're too fast.
No, that's right. So when I think about the length of the races that they run and the conditions that you find yourselves in, and the point you just made that they're responding to voice, what I'm imagining is the subtle differences in the vocal range and also the kind of when they know you so well, are they quite pro- kind of proactive? Do they intuitively know what you might be doing next? Does that go on?
Um, there definitely are dogs that will try to do that. It's pretty hard to second guess a human. We're so unpredictable.
Yeah. Mm.
But there definitely are. I've definitely seen dogs go like, "Okay, I think I know what we're doing, and you don't need to tell me. We'll figure it. I can figure this out."
Yeah.
Um, I'm, you know, I'm not all that keen on it because they don't always have the same sort of parameters in their brains that we do.
Yeah.
So, for example, at one time in my life, I spent a winter in Whitehorse in the capital city, which at that time had about 15, 20,000 people in it. And I was living in a little cabin on the outskirts of town, and I was going to the university every day to go to school. And it was a particularly snowy winter, and so I was able to actually use my dogs to mush to school, to the college. But in doing so, I had to cross a fairly busy commuter road and at rush hour. So there was quite a lot of traffic. And so, you know, I would come up to this road and I would stop and I'd wait for a gap in the traffic and then would zoom across just like you would on foot or on a bicycle or something like that. But as time went by, these dogs decided that they could figure out when there was a suitable gap in the traffic. And so they'd see a gap and they go like, "Oh, we can make it. Let's go." But sometimes it was clear that they hadn't necessarily accounted for like the dog sled and the person behind them, like so they would choose gaps in the traffic that were a bit smaller than I would have chosen. So
Wow.
we had to have a,
Lucky
we
you're
had to have
here.
a little chat about like, no, you can't make these decisions. Um,
Understood, understood. And I think the other thing as well, you've already alluded to it, while they are required for you to undertake your work, although you can obviously get a snowmobile if you want to, the companionship and them, physically being in your presence, I imagine that's quite significant as well. The company of things that might defend you, perhaps. If a grizzly bear comes, would they naturally bark at it and try and get it to run away? What do they instinctively do?
well, they absolutely bark at bears for sure. And they have most of them have a distinctive sort of low tone woof that they do at
Yeah.
bears. Um, they're not bred or trained to be guard dogs or
Okay.
def- like livestock defending dogs or anything like that. So
Hmm.
they're not particularly good at that.
Okay.
They're just as likely it's pretty unpredictable what they'll do. Um, three most of my dogs are pretty keen hunters, which like obviously we don't go hunting after caribou and moose with the dogs, but when they're running around in the field, they're always on the lookout for mice and squirrels,
Wow.
and they're pretty good at it. It's really quite surprising, but I wouldn't. I would. I would trust them to alert me if there were a wild animal around, but
Yeah.
I wouldn't trust them to do the right thing about it.
Okay.
If you see what I
Yeah.
mean, because
Understood.
they're simply not trained for that, and they're not bred for it. If I
Yeah.
had a Maremma, it would be a different thing, or even or an Alsatian type dog. It'd be a very different
Mm.
thing because they would. They that is what they're bred for, is for defensive purposes.
Yeah. I think I read something about a lady who was with a German Shepherd, actually, an Alsatian. She was going for a run with that dog, and the dog did defend her. I think she did suffer a few little injuries, but the dog did manage to keep I think there were 3 bears, and she managed to keep the one that was being unhelpful out of the way. So I understand what you're saying about the, again, I do put it down to the DNA, and because German Shepherds are designed that way, and their training. I hear that quite clearly. This has been fascinating. Really, thank you so much. I want to see them, but of course they're outside and they're doing their own thing. Perhaps we might get a photograph with you and them, so we can put that up on the podcast when we're broadcasting it. So, any final things you'd like to share for the listeners here, Sebastian, before we say ta-ra?
I don't think so, but I can definitely find some photographs I can share with you.
Brilliant. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for your time and this fascinating conversation. And thank you for jumping on this and getting it out. I can't wait for this to be released. It's I wasn't expecting when I started this little journey to be speaking to people from across the globe. I hoped it would be the case, but someone like 4,000 miles away in my first 10 is just fantastic. So have a fabulous weekend, and thank you once again for your time.
So that's a wrap. Thank you so much for tuning in. If we've not connected already, you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm on there most days. You'll find me under CXEI Sandra. And also, if you want to find out a bit more about my work, then you can pop along to my website, www.eievolution.com. One final thing, and in the spirit of customer experience and feedback, I wonder if you might consider leaving a review on Spotify. I'll leave that one with you. So until the next time, be well and be pawsome. Ta-ra!